Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our next webinar with the World Breeding Federation. It's great to see so many of you again here tonight. If you hear a little bit of noise in the background, my little niece and nephew from Germany are over to visit. They're very excited. And so you might hear the occasional woo in the background. That's them. I just thought I'd get that out of the way. I hope that's okay with you. And apart from that, thank you so much to Professor Natalie Waran for joining us tonight to share her insights into a process that I think is so central to what we do every year with our mares and our foals, and so central to our concern for the welfare of our horses. We know that weaning is a really difficult thing to do. There are lots of different methods that have been tried and applied, and I know many of our breeders have enormous knowledge on the subject, and we thought it would be lovely to share experiences here and to give everybody the opportunity to learn more about the science angle on this important topic. As always, if you have questions, you're very welcome to write them in our Q&A, and we will pick those up and share them with Natalie and hopefully have a really good discussion. If you are please going to join the webinar under your name so that we then know who you are, we can follow up on any questions that might require some further conversations afterwards. If you are commenting anonymously, it's impossible for us to do that. So please make sure you comment with your name. Please bear with us because, of course, time is always limited on these webinars. So we might not be able to get around to everyone's questions, but we certainly will do our very best. And we really welcome your input on this important topic. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Natalie, and we're very grateful to have her here because of her enormous wealth of knowledge and experience on the topic. Natalie studied zoology at Glasgow University and then obtained a PhD from Cambridge. And she has worked in many different countries all over the world, including China, India, Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So she's a real world person, which I think suits our topic of being a World Breeding Federation very well. She's also the chair of the FEI and Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission. So, you know, a really important role in furthering the welfare of our horses. And we're all really keen to find out what we as breeders can do to help with this important subject. Natalie has led on a number of strategic projects. And for example, she is also the inaugural director of the new International Centre for Animal Welfare Education at the University of Edinburgh, which is, of course, one of our our leading universities in the UK, and particularly well known for its fantastic equine veterinary science work. So it's been really great to have Natalie here and to hear her talk. So I am going to, in fact, we can't see you, Natalie. Would you be able to, oh, there you are. That's better. Hello. So, yeah, so Natalie, welcome. We have lots of attendees tonight, so hopefully lots of really good discussions. And I believe you have prepared a talk for us. Oh, and there's also Nadine, everyone. Say hi to Nadine. We haven't seen her before, so Nadine, also welcome and thank you for joining us. Nadine is the one who keeps me on the straight and narrow on these things, so very important person. So thank you to both of you for being here. And I think let's just launch straight into presentation on weaning and foals.
Oh, well, kia ora, Eva and Nadine, and hello from a very early New Zealand. It's 6 o'clock in the morning here. It's winter, it's quite dark. So I'm very grateful to everybody for being willing to start an hour later, because it meant that I could perhaps be a little bit more awake when I speak to you. I'm going to try and share my screen and then we can get started. So I'm just hoping this works. And if I can find it. Now, does that work for everybody? Yeah, good. Okay, so
yeah,
you can see it good, and hopefully you can hear me well. First of all, I would like to say I'm extremely humbled to be talking to an audience such as yourselves. I mean, you're world breeders. You breed the most amazingly successful horses in the world, and obviously have a wealth of knowledge. And I certainly am not one of you. I'm a scientist. I come from a background of being interested particularly in equine behaviour and welfare. And I have been very fortunate to, as Eva has talked about, maybe it's because I'm older now, but I've had a fair bit of experience working with different sort of areas of equine welfare to do with transport, living environments, and I have done a bit of work on weaning. But I would say my most kind of the largest amount of experience I've had was doing my PhD many years ago, where my PhD was on the behaviour and welfare of early weaned pigs. And so you'll see in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about other species, because I think we've got a lot to learn from other animals and the research that's been done elsewhere. So I'm going to start, and hopefully this is actually now working okay. I'm not sure I can get rid of that bit at the top there, I'm afraid. No, I don't know. So just
no,
to really...
this looks absolutely fine, Natalie. It's probably
right.
Zoom putting a thing on your screen. We're always battling with that.
As long as you can see it. So this charming man is Ingmar de Vos, and he asked me to chair a commission, and this was the point of the commission. It was started in June 2022, and it's all about the future involvement of horses in sport. And Ingmar and the FEI board at the time decided that it was quite important, given the kind of increasing scrutiny that the sports horse world was under, that we needed to have a commission to start to look much more closely at what we could do to ensure that there was public confidence, there was equestrian confidence, but there was also a spotlight on just making sure that we were putting welfare first and foremost in favour of the horse. And the reason for all of this was because of the increasing public scrutiny. And these are just some of the articles that you'll see, and there's many more of them, that relate to a whole range of different disciplines. And I think the important thing to recognise is that I will talk a little bit about racing. And the reason for that is because for the public, horses involved in sport are all horses. They don't really make a distinction between one thing or another. So what happens in racing can also have quite a knock-on effect to what happens, or the opinion for other animals, for other disciplines. And there has been a demand by many scientists and ethicists for equestrianism to adopt a much more ethics-based, proactive and progressive approach to the protection of equine welfare to ensure ongoing trust of all stakeholders. So the commission was really set up to look at how we can maintain and enhance social license to operate, and also recognise that our mission really was around equine ethics and well-being, considering equine welfare in sport, ensuring that horses involved in sport can experience positive welfare throughout their lives. Now, you'll see why I'm telling you all of this in a minute, but I think it's important to recognise that where I come from is a position of looking at the welfare of horses in relation to us being able to continue to use horses or involve horses in leisure and sport. And so it's important to engage all of you in this issue of social license to operate, and recognise that living in a bubble and thinking that, well, everybody else out there doesn't really understand us and therefore they're irrelevant isn't actually very helpful. We can't give ourselves or award ourselves a social license. We depend on others to trust and have confidence in us as equine stakeholders to make sure that we can continue to do what we enjoy doing, or what we make a living out of as well. So social license to operate, I'm sure most of you are familiar now with this term. It's an unwritten social contract or an agreement between the public and society and an industry or an organisation. And Lots of different industries. Think about research animals, think about mining, for example. All of these are industries, and they do seek to continue to protect their social license. And we have the same issues within sport, in different sports, but equestrian sport and the involvement of horses in sport is particularly vulnerable to negative public opinion, because it involves a horse or an animal, and in particular a horse. And we know that generally the public sort of, I don't know, they sort of deem to see horses as being magical creatures. So they have particular concerns about them. So social license is about public or stakeholder perception. And certainly that perception can be a kind of low trust situation. So something can happen, it can cause quite a fling to being, a low trust model, or it can be a high trust model. And of course, where we want it to be is in the high trust area. Social license is particularly vulnerable, and it's important because when we have public acceptance, we can self-regulate and we're free to operate. But if we lose credibility and confidence, we lose the trust, we end up in a social control situation, and that's where things can get banned. We've seen that with other industries. So when we're talking about different stakeholders, we're talking about a whole range of different people, not just the public. A lot of the work that the Commission has done has been to do large-scale surveys, not just of the public, but of equestrians generally, and a variety of stakeholders. And of course, you as breeders are very much one of the most important stakeholders in this. There are lots of different lenses that you can look through to ask opinion about whether or not we should involve horses in sport. And don't forget, there's also the horse's view, and that's where the research has come in, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. But what it's important to recognise is that we are in a situation, not of crisis, but of importance. This is very relevant stuff, and you have such an important role to play in this as breeders, because at the moment, when you ask the general public, do you believe horses enjoy being involved in sport? Then many of them will say mostly not, 67%. You ask equestrian stakeholders, these are people who know horses and have horses, they may compete at a high level or at a local level, they may be breeders like yourself. Some of them, 50% of those will say that horses mostly, that if you ask them if horses enjoy being involved in sport, they'll say mostly not. And that's the situation as it stands at the moment. So when we're looking at what it means, what a life for a horse should be when involved in sport, we're looking at a whole range of different aspects of their life. And what sorts of things make up a good life are related to things to do with freedom and forage and social contact and so on. And there's quite a wealth of research on how important these things are to horses at different stages of their development. But the important thing for the sport horse is that they are a working animal at the end of the day. They're not, they can be pets and they can be much loved, but at the end of the day, they are very expensive commodities, and they're there to do a job, and they live a particular type of life. They're produced to go to competitions and to perform. They are transported probably a lot more and frequently and a lot longer distances, and they have a specific type of management regime that has to happen for them to be trained and prepared for competition. So there's a living environment that is specific to them, and it's important that we also look to see where we can provide a good life for them within their context. So, as I said, you World Breeding Federation for Sport Horses people have quite an important role as equine stakeholders in this picture. And of course, you have your own plans, and you have a plan to develop a strategy for animal welfare and good breeding practice. And you also have your vision and mission statements that talk to the importance of breeding and supporting happy equine athletes, which is really important when you start to think about how you set those animals up so that they can be happy equine athletes. So let's just go back a little bit and think about, what do we mean when we're talking about happiness or quality of life? So first of all, there's obviously the physical health. So when you're producing an animal, thinking about you as a breeder, you'll be thinking about producing an animal that is likely to have the best physical health possible. So it's going to have, not like this horse here, that doesn't have particularly grand conformation, but you're always going to be looking to the conformation, health attributes and all the rest of it. You also have to think about behavioral health, and I'm going to come back to this right at the end because I'm going to set you some challenges. But how behaviorally healthy is this animal? How good a life can it live? And its mental health. How set up is it based on all of its life experiences to be able to cope well with the environments that it's going to be placed within? Bearing in mind that some of this will be learning and training and preparation, and some of this will be genetic and the choice that you make of who you breed with. So when we're talking about quality of life, and particularly trying to work out what a good life is, you have to start from an appreciation that animals are sentient. Now, this might seem like a normal, commonplace thing for people like us who have animals in our lives, but for a long time, scientists didn't believe that animals were capable of feeling emotions or affective states, as they're called, negative and positive emotions. But now we have sentience as a word in many of our animal welfare laws. But we don't know a huge amount about what animal happiness looks like, or what it is, or how an animal really feels when it's in that kind of state of mind that we would call happiness. And I think there's quite a lot of research that is now going on, and you'll see that as we go through the talk, to try to identify really robust indicators of positive emotions in horses in particular. And obviously this is Bonita. You can see she's a very happy, fat donkey who isn't so happy most of the time because she has to wear a muzzle. So when we're talking about a good life, we are actually talking about lots of positive experiences. We want positive emotions to be the most felt. I mean, bearing in mind that in any one day, any person is going to feel lots of positive stuff, but there'll probably be some negative stuff too. So life isn't always, positive. But generally speaking, a life that is experiencing more on the side of positive emotions. And we need to understand what horses need to be able to experience. So not only what it looks like when they're in a positive mind state, but also what they need to be able to provide them with that situation. And so because we can't speak to horses, well, there are some people who think they can, which is fantastic. But most people are not terribly versed with able to speak equine, whatever. We're pretty good at observing behavioral language in horses, but generally speaking, we don't know what's going on in their mind. We don't know what they're thinking about. We're not sure what they want. And we also need to understand that the things that they want might mean something different to them. So when they see a field of grass, then are they thinking about the sensation of eating the grass, or what else goes on when they're actually at grass? All the other behaviors that they can show. And so it's important to recognize that there's a whole array of behavior that is important to a horse. And just looking at, the kind of environmental side of it isn't going to tell you an awful lot about what's going on mentally. But it is important that we recognize that when we're talking about well-being, equine well-being, we're not just talking about nutrition and what we put into the animal. The physical environment it lives in, its health, and its social behavior. We're talking about how all of these things relate to how that animal feels, its mental state, its affective state. And increasingly, in order to characterize what a good life is, as we start to learn more about domains 1 to 4, and the impact that these have on the animal's behavior and physiology, we start to recognize what is good welfare, what are good expressions, and what is not so good. So stress behavior and so on. And we're having a lot more research about positive or happy athletes starting to come out. And here's some work. Here's me and my scraggle bunch here in New Zealand. and we've just had some funding given to us by the Hong Kong Jockey Club to look at behavioural indicators of positive welfare in thoroughbreds. So what I want to talk to you breeders about is your part to play in this, how you can set horses up to have a good life. And I would say, out of all of the things that a horse needs in order to set itself up for a good life, one of them is resilience. It's kind of very much a human term at the moment. Kids not being quite so resilient, not like when we were growing up, where we were sort of left to our own devices and had to sort ourselves out and fall off horses and all the rest of it. Now kids, it seems, are far more wrapped in cotton wool and might not have quite the same resilience. Well, I'm talking about resilience here in relation to foals and how we can make them more resilient. How we can help them to cope better with all of the situations that they're going to face in their sporting life. So I would put to you, and this is my sort of take on this, that there are a number of critical control development periods that you as breeders have kind of direct access to and greatest influence over. First of all, I'm not going to talk about the first three in great detail. I'll come back to mate choice a little bit at the end. But there's obviously the impact that the environment that the animal is in relation to stress that will impact on the unborn foal. There's obviously mate choice, which, the temperament of horses and how that will, what part of that is inherited that will impact on the fit of the horse that you're breeding in terms of its behavior and its adaptability. And then there's the whole birthing experience. But what I'm going to talk to you about, because I've been asked to talk about weaning, is what we know about weaning and a little bit about early handling as well, so that we can look at the bits that can be influenced. Some of these things are more genetic. Some of the other things here are more about the environment and learning. They're much more easily shaped. So why is weaning, in my opinion, a critical control period? Well, I hadn't realised this, but I've written a review article about weaning in 2008, and I had a good read of it again. I thought it's not actually it's not too bad. It still seems to me to be relatively up to date. But anyway, in that, I said that there was a need to understand the potential longer term impact of weaning on trainability and possibly later maternal behaviour, and whether the stresses associated with early weaning for individuals have detrimental effects on that performance horse. Because we've never really had a good scan to see whether those, those big longitudinal studies are actually showing a weaning effect. So just to start, all of this, weaning naturally occurs when the mare and foal decide they've had enough of each other. And one may decide to do that sooner than the other, generally between 9 and 11 months of age, but can go on longer if you leave them. Artificial weaning, we tend to do it depending on where you are in the world, but generally between 4 and 7 months. It is considered to be one of the most stressful experiences in a domestic foal's life, which I find quite interesting because it is a trauma. It's when we call it a trauma, I'm saying it is a traumatic experience that happens, but it can be done well and it can be done badly, as you know. And I often think, well, we all have stressful experiences in our lives, and we've all, had to separate from our mother and so on at some point. What impact it has on people is a kind of combination of both their genetic makeup, their predisposition for being stressed, but also the experience that they have at the time, and that's quite an individual experience. There's been a lot of focus around how to alleviate weaning stress in terms of the different methodologies you can use, but it does seem to me that what constitutes best practice in weaning depends very much on what your desired outcomes are. So the outcomes, if you're going to wean artificially or early or whatever the term is that you use, or before the natural weaning process, then the outcome that you might be looking for is mainly because you have a large breeding herd and you want to optimize reproductive efficiency, because you need to move that mare on and get her back in the herd and so on. So that might be the primary reason for the weaning age. You might also be looking, and I would have thought this is for the most part, optimizing the physical development of the foal. So not weaning too early, because you obviously want to have them on the mare for as long as possible, given the situation that you're in. Trying to improve the management of the foal's nutritional intake without the mare interfering. And then that will enable earlier marketing of foals if you've got foals looking much more mature. And facilitating the foal's relationship with humans is another reason for weaning. And the chosen weaning method will depend on a whole range of different factors. So that's another reason why I'm not going to tell you what's the right weaning method. I'm just going to tell you what sorts of ideas there are out there and what the latest research is. But basically, I mean, it'll depend on your own particular circumstances, what facilities you've got, but also the individual foal and its stage of development and its health, its ability to cope with change. You can tell that from the foal itself. Some of them have got particularly strong mare-foal attachments. And there's a lot of research now on attachment theory and how that impacts on the mare and the way in which the foal then can almost be weaned because the mare is so attached. And then also the ability of the horse owner to carry out the chosen method. There are a lot of significant changes, and they often happen at the same time. So there's, first of all, let's not get away from it. We talked about the animal as an emotional being. So there is an emotional response that's provoked. There's also the fact that it's the end of the suckling or nursing, the pleasant activity that stimulates the delivery of hormones and neurotransmitters that will induce that lovely relaxed and calm status that you see when you look at a suckling animal. There's the change in the nutrition. There's the loss of the primary source of protection, and also don't forget the amount of the time that mare and foal are together is a really important phase for social learning, and also just again, part of that resilience. There's the change in the physical and social environment. There's temporary isolation, because some methods do use that. There may well be greater interaction with other conspecifics, so where you've weaned into groups from animals that have been pretty much on their own with their mother. And then there's increased interactions that do happen with humans at that time. So there's a lot of stuff going on for these animals. And it's stressful for both the mare and the foal. And there's a whole range of different stressors that you can see here. And we're going to talk a little bit about the behavioral and cognitive ones. So when we look at early weaning, there's a whole range of different physiological changes that are associated with early weaning. Some gastrointestinal gut upsets. You often see diarrhea, decreased appetite, change of diet, increased weight loss, sometimes anorexia. There's been reports of higher weight losses in females than in males. There's certainly, in most studies, increased cortisol levels, whether that's serum or saliva. And interestingly, in one study, fillies showed a higher overall cortisol concentration in saliva than colts in the post-weaning period, which might explain their higher weight loss. And then, of course, if you're stressed and there's a period of time when the animal is stressed, and there's a change of diet and they're not eating, then there's going to be an impact on the immune function of the foal as well. And there's a whole range of different behaviours that are seen around weaning, and you'll be familiar with these: increased locomotion and vocalization, being obvious ones. And then you often see, and again, conversely, if you like, a decrease in locomotion in some, where you get them just standing still, and a decrease in just being social generally. And you may find an increase in abnormal oral activity, and some signs of separation anxiety. So let's just look at some of these studies, because some of the studies, if you've been doing a lot of reading about this, are quite conflicting, and that's why it's very confusing. So here's one that was carried out in 2021. And these researchers looked at the behavioural and hormonal effects of 2 weaning situations in trotter foals. They had 2 groups. They weaned at 5 months or at 7 months, so group 1 and group 2. They weaned in pairs and handled in group 1, that was weaned at 5 months, and they weaned at 7 months in group 2 into one group that weren't handled. And then they looked to see what the impact of these different weaning methods would be. So there was an impact. They looked at stress in relation to behaviour and stress hormones and interactions between the foals. And they found that on the day of weaning, all of them had increased vocalizations and decreased time eating. The decrease in time spent eating was also present on day 7 for the group 1 foals, but not the group 2. And 1 week after weaning, foals in group 1 had a higher cortisol in hair samples compared to foals in group 2. So what would you conclude from that? Is weaning at 5 months better than weaning at 7 months? Or is weaning in pairs and handled at 7 months, which they didn't do, better than weaning in one group and unhandled? Is handling important? Is social group important? Is weaning age important? Really difficult to tell with a study. I'm afraid to say that in my reading there are a number of studies that have put so many factors together that we can't actually control anything. Luckily, there are other studies that have gone a little bit beyond that. And this study here looked at the 2 different methods that they called progressive weaning and abrupt weaning. So abrupt weaning would be just taking the mare and the foal away out of sight. Taking the mare away out of sight. But the progressive weaning was where the foal was getting used to being separated from the mare. So it starts with 15 minutes and then gradually increase over a period of, I think it was about 4 weeks. It was a fairly long extended period with the foal separated every day for a period of time. So it's quite an interesting one because it seems on the surface that progressive weaning, where the mare and foal are given a chance to separate from each other, might be a better methodology than the abrupt weaning. But let's have a look. So these researchers did quite a lot of sampling, as you can see, because they were interested in a whole array of different information. But just looking at some of their data, overall body weight and average daily gain were not affected by the weaning method. There were no significant changes in parasite fecal egg counts across the 2 weaning methods, which is quite interesting because that kind of looks to immune function and so on. However, there was a significant increase in salivary cortisol levels in the the abrupt weaning group as compared to the progressive weaning group. And after weaning, there was an increase in streptococcus in the animals of the abrupt weaning group relative to the progressive weaning group. And gut pH was lower, they were more acidic in the progressive group than in the abrupt weaning group at 5 days post-weaning. So there was differences, I would say. So was there a long-term impact of weaning method on something significant like weight gain? So it didn't seem to matter whether these foals were weaned abruptly or using this progressive method. They all had a decrease in daily weight gain in the first week after weaning. But the method of weaning had no effect on post-weaning weight gain 10 days after weaning or in the long term up to 480 days of age. So weaning them abruptly didn't affect their weight gain. And there was no advantage of the progressive method. And it's suggested that practically it's probably more important to consider the maturity and live weight as a criteria for weaning foals rather than age at weaning. There's also a fair, There's also a fair bit of research that's looked at different types of separation, whether it's abrupt and total separation or phased, as we've just seen. And they do all show conflicting results. And most of the recent studies now suggest that placing foals in the presence of familiar but unrelated mares significantly reduces post-weaning stress. So having an older mare that stays with the foals seems to be one of the things that does make a difference. However, let's look at some other research. This is abrupt versus a stepwise approach to the weaning experience. So here you've got two groups again. The SWR group is where the mares were removed to another location, but the foals remained where they were. And the PR group was where the foals were removed from the mare and the familiar location. So they had two WAMs, if you like, at the same time. So the idea behind this study was to try to separate the separation from the mother from the other changes that would happen around weaning in relation to a change to the familiar environment. And what these researchers showed was that when you remove the mares to another location, but they leave the foals in a familiar location, there's lower acute stress shortly after both the weaning and the moving compared with those foals that have the two happening at the same time. And there's a significant drop in growth, however, after being moved to the new environment. So they may well have stayed and been less stressed because they didn't have everything happen at the same time. But then when they were moved, they did have a significant drop in growth. And that was a fairly long-standing one because the weight differences between the SWR group and the PR group were still apparent nearly 5 months later. So the group that was removed from the mare and the location had 50% higher concentrations of cortisol shortly after weaning and moving to their new environment. So they definitely experienced an acute stress. However, they did then have a relatively stable increase in their weight over the observed period. So they recovered from it and were then able to move on and feed and do quite well. And you can see some data there. What these researchers did say was that individual personal traits suggested. So what they said was that there were differences between individual foals and that it was really the individual foal trait that kind of dictated how well they coped with these different situations. So is abrupt weaning, because I think abrupt weaning has always had quite a bad, exposure really. Is it better or worse for welfare? Does it set the horse up any worse or any better for its life? So the pilot study that was carried out by URBA reported that cortisol release was elevated and sustained over a longer period in foals that were weaned progressively than those that were weaned abruptly. So it's suggesting that these foals may well have, because they've had this exposure to these short separations prior to weaning, that they have become more sensitized with their stress response. And that might lead them to be more stress susceptible later in life because they've experienced a longer chronic stress. We know that there's an alteration in foal intestinal microbiomes regardless of weaning protocol. Obviously, they're coming off milk and relying more on food. But abrupt weaning may lead to the gut microbiota being better primed for weaning compared to the progressive method, perhaps because separating mares and foals in this kind of transient method leads to more sustained release of these stress hormones, which then impacts on the animal's ability to digest food, and that's not so good for it. And weight gain appears to remain stable in the abrupt weaning groups, which again suggests that they're able to make the most of their food and are less stressed in the long term. So on the face of it, it does look like, even though it doesn't feel as as sympathetic to the foal, that perhaps abrupt weaning at the right age, when the foal is at the right stage of health and development, is a one-off trauma that is that the animals get over relatively quickly, whereas prolonging the weaning experience might actually make it worse. So when we look at all of the different changes, we know from the results of these sorts of research that separation from the dam, definitely there's a stress response. Isolation and confinement, we know, does happen for some weaning methods, and these foals definitely are stressed more when they're individually weaned and on their own, and it may well predispose them to the development of abnormal oral stereotypies or behaviours. The physical environment, there's some research that shows that the barn-weaned foals are more stressed than if you put them out to pasture to wean them, and that foals moved into familiar environments appeared in the short term to be less stressed than those placed in new environments, but then there's a catch-up later on. So when we look then at creep feeding, change in diet and delivery, we know that creep feeding is beneficial in that it familiarises foals with the new food type, it provides them with fibre and so on. It may reduce weaning stress and if animals are motivated to feed. And it does mean that these foals exhibit more consistent feeding patterns, which again allows for more consistent growth rates rather than the fluctuations you might find that affect things like bone abnormalities or bone growth. There's very little research really on creep feeding in relation to mitigation of weaning stress, but it does appear that creep feeding doesn't really change the weaning stress response. There's no difference in post-weaning weight losses of creep-fed and non-creep-fed foals, although again that's going to depend on the weaning protocol. But it may well be that early creep feeding could sensitize the gut, could lead to an increase in gastric acidity. And this is the bit that's suggested to increase the likelihood of the animal performing abnormal oral activities, which could lead to stereotypic behavior later in life. So foals that develop abnormal oral behaviors after weaning were those that spent more time suckling from the dam and twice as much time teat nuzzling prior to weaning. So it's quite a good indicator. If you see, you've got differences between your foals, then it may well be that there's an indication of the foals that might struggle more and may be more likely to develop abnormal behavior if they're showing this response. Also, less frequent provision of food as occurs following weaning, because they're used to having more access to food, does potentially lead to this increase in stomach acidity, lowered pH, which may cause the animal discomfort. And the abnormal oral activity may well be also a coping mechanism to cope with that discomfort. However, the earlier research that did suggest all of this isn't always consistent, again, depending on the study that you look at. This is a large-scale study of 673 foals that were 4 months of age prior to weaning, and they were weaned and then had access to grass paddocks post-weaning, and then they were brought in once a day for feeding. And only 3 of these foals developed oral stereotypies, and all of those foals were on different farms. So it does suggest that there is a protective, a protection really from any of the problems that I've just discussed if the foals have access to grass paddocks and are in social groups. We know that the composition of diet at weaning affects behaviour, and foals that are fed high fat and high fibre diets are seen to be calmer immediately after weaning and more able to deal with a series of different temperament tests compared with the foals that were fed a starch and sugar diet. So worth looking at what's in these creep feeds, because feeding a high fibre diet, we've just talked about them being at pasture, and giving them space to graze and play and so on might actually provide the best environment for ensuring the least stressful, impactful weaning experience in this kind of abrupt weaning that we've just talked about, but potentially with these older mares involved as buddies. And social company is important, not just necessarily the conspecifics, the foals themselves or the older mares, but also humans. It appears that the development of stereotypies are reduced in thoroughbred foals if humans are in the picture when the mare is removed for covering and doesn't come back. Just want to talk a little bit about this sort of human interventions. There is something called imprint training. Some of you may do this. It was originally advocated by a veterinarian, Miller, and he really talked about, this isn't early handling, this is quite intensive and I would say quite invasive handling of foals, and suggested that this increased their handleability later in life. So this was as soon as the foal was born, basically touching it all over, clipping it, doing all sorts of things to it as a very young foal. The results that he had indicated that days 0 to 21 post-weaning, he called the most critical period for handling and for having this handling effect. However, other researchers have come along since and have said that there's no obvious benefits in terms of improved responses to situations and stimuli later in life. So it's a lot of effort, and there's not really a long-term benefit. And in addition, there are questions around the impact, the negative impact that this kind of intensive handling can have on the young foal, but also in interrupting the relationship between the foal and its dam at quite an important critical time for their relationship. However, in saying that, early structured handling has been looked at quite a bit by researchers. And here's a study by Lansade that shows that putting a halter on and picking up feet and leading foals immediately following weaning was related to less reactivity and increased ease of handling as compared with non-handle controls, with the effect lasting for the 18 months that they studied them following treatment. So it does suggest that you can use that weaning period as a critical control period for establishing positive human-horse relationships. But you can also establish negative human-horse relationships at the same time, because learning goes both ways. Animals obviously are very quick to associate one thing with a consequence. So it's important to think about the kind of handling, who's handling, and the types of behaviour that are desirable or non-desirable in those foals at that time. So I'm just going to talk briefly about other species. We know actually quite a lot more about other species. And that's because they're production animals. There's been a lot more research money that's been pumped into them. There's been more welfare concerns. So there's been a lot of welfare research. But this one I really like because this was about piglets. And it showed, this one's about rearing environments. And it was quite a lot of studies have shown how important early rearing environments are for improving the animal's ability to adapt to situations later, to being less excitable about things, and being able to learn better later in life. And so these piglet studies showed that stress adaptability is shaped by housing, human and social experiences early in life. Regular positive human interactions have an enduring effect on reducing pigs' fear of humans. Stimulation and opportunities for activity provided for in an enriched environment, so where there's lots that the animal can do, lots of interaction that it can have. This causes changes in dendritic branching in the brain, and that these changes may help in terms of the central nervous system. So that's where the hyperexcitability and stereotype behavior centers might be, but also in that kind of plasticity of behavior that we talk about. So being able to have a range of different responses rather than a very kind of rigid response. And I think that's really important in a sports horse, to be able to be adaptable, to be able to learn well, to learn how to learn early, and to have a plasticity of response, to have that kind of ability to trial different things. So these are, you know, a rich brain, lots of dendritic tentacles, and a less enriched brain. So that's piglets. So priming for success. What else would we want animals to, you know, our horses to have that we could do with thinking about how we've weaned or how we've reared them? So there's evidence of pain or stress priming in animals that's come from some sheep work. And there's a fair bit on this actually, but these are two things that I've picked up here for you. For lambs, there's early experiences that have been associated with that kind of period around weaning, but also around some of the routine procedures that happen to them. So early life experiences can sometimes be transgenerational, and they affect individual phenotypes. So here's a study that showed that routine tail docking or a simulated mild infection that could normally happen for a lamb on days 3 to 4 of life was associated with higher levels of pain-related behaviour when giving birth as adults compared with animals that hadn't had those experiences. So they'd been primed almost for pain. The ones that had a simulated mild infection, these ewes also then gave birth to lambs who showed decreased pain sensitivity in standardized tests during days 2 to 3 of life. So again, there was a difference in the way in which pain was moderated. And then the timing of a single noxious stimulus in young animals can affect subsequent pain perception, e.g. younger age at castration by rubber ring, in this case for lambs, is associated with increased pain responses when they were tail docked later on. So this is interesting, again, in terms of timing of castration and so on. We don't know a huge amount about that in horses. So there is evidence of priming or sensitizing young animals at a young age through what happens to them to become more sensitive to pain or stress later in life. And there's even some stuff in chickens as well, chooks as we call them here. Chooks that they don't live very long, some of these chooks, but when they were exposed to stressful situations on their first day of life, just after they'd hatched in a noisy incubator, and where they were then handled for sex sorting, vaccination, if they didn't end up being a male and having to die, and transport. And these were associated with negative longer-term impacts, higher corticosteroid responses to restraint when they were 6 weeks of age, more tail feather damage when they were 20 weeks of age. That's often where they start pecking each other. And also this interesting thing here I want to explore, more pessimistic judgment bias at 10 weeks of age. So these animals appeared to be in a low mood state. They tended to view the world with a negative lens when given choice tests later in life. So when we talk about pessimism or optimism, there are lots of different life experiences that happen for a horse that can contribute to its tendency to view the world negatively or positively, and therefore to be able to live a good life. And one of the things that we do know is that fear is a relatively stable attribute in a horse. This is very much part of its nature, you know, the genetics of it. And so we know that foals that are kept with their dams on large pastures until weaning and remained relatively unhandled until training for the first 5 months, when they were tested, they were initially trained to come into the test arena on their own, and then they had to walk to their dam, who was placed at the other end of the arena. And then later, they were exposed to 2 additional types of novel object tests, where they were exposed to something that was new and potentially frightening. And what was shown was that the reaction towards these novel objects was the best predictor of their fearfulness later in life. So if those foals were frightened in the first test, they were going to be frightened in the subsequent tests. So you could always classify foals as being fearful ones and not fearful ones, and it was relatively stable across time. And there's not that many of these behavioural traits that are relatively stable across time, and therefore things that you can identify early on that you can then manipulate through some sort of intervention. So you can test for fearfulness using these novel object tests, particularly around weaning or post-weaning, because that seems to be the most effective time to decide. And these are fairly simple tests. And then you can classify your foals and you can change their fear response, because you can then bring in learning. This is the nurture part of it. And you can structure the learning experience to reduce the fearfulness of these foals during the first few weeks of life, or post-weaning if you're doing your test post-weaning. And if you're using the period before weaning, then you can use the dam. So as long as you've habituated the dam to a lot of scary things, and then you bring the foal in and you do structured tests, you can then expose the foal with the dam to different frightening objects, and they show reduced fear responses and increased exploratory behaviour at the time, and then when they're tested 5 months later. And I think this is really through a combination of the maternal transmission and also individual learning. So there are ways of kind of changing things. So when we're talking about pessimism or optimism, we're talking about an animal's cognitive bias. So they come to the world potentially with a susceptibility to be more frightened, or they develop through their learning and their early experiences a response to the world that relates to those early experiences, that is one of thinking the worst all the time. We call this having your glass half empty. So if you're a pessimist and you look at a glass that is half water in it, you'll think it's half empty. If you're an optimist, you'll think it's half full. You know, it might fill up at some point. And what we're interested in from the early experiences of the foal is what makes the foal likely to be a half empty or a half full animal, because that's also going to affect its life experience. And here's two horses, they're both mine. This one here on the left, you can see up here, she was brought up on a hill in Gisborne. She's an Irish Draught cross thoroughbred. She was exposed to a few things early in life, not a lot, because she was on a hill. She had some very easy early handling, lots of things that were fairly positive in her life, very easy horse, has a very healthy, positive way of looking at the world. This is Big. I think you can tell in every bit of Big's expression here that Big is one of those half empty types. He always thinks that the sky is going to fall down if a rope is on the ground or something horrible happened to him. Now, he was bred as a show jumper, I think had, not a particularly easy early life. He was a very big, clunky horse, probably wasn't really up to doing the job that he was bred for, but was being trained, along with a lot of other horses to do the job. And he still remains at the age of 16, despite living in hopefully a very nice environment, an extremely pessimistic horse. And so it's quite a trait, when you've got something that is one thing or the other, really understanding where they're coming from, trying to give them the best experiences, but they will still often bring to that their life experience and their attitude. And there's a lot of studies that have been done on cognitive bias and pessimism and optimism in animals. And, you can see, here's a dog one here, which is what happens is the dog is trained to know that there's a bucket that's got food in it and a bucket that doesn't have food in it. And then the bucket that doesn't have food in it is placed in the wrong position. Now, an animal that has come from a good background, so in this case, a pet dog that's had a great life, will always have a go. Just, it's not in the right place, but it's bound to have food in it because it's a glass half full. Whereas the dog that's come from a bad background, has had bad handling or not a great experience of life, will tend to not want to approach or be slow to approach because it doesn't make sense and it's unlikely to give him the right answer. and that's cognitive bias testing. And it's used quite a lot now in animal testing. There are a few studies that have been done on horses, but it has been shown that horses living in more restricted environments show much more pessimistic responses in these bias tests, suggesting that their welfare is likely to be more impaired, or they're less likely to be able to live a good life. I'm just going to move on from this. This is really about emotional stuff, and I realise that we're running out of time, and I just want to finish off with a few questions for you. So, yeah, I was asked to come and talk to you about a good life for horses with weaning as a kind of focus. I've given you some information about the early handling, weaning, early training part of the what I would say were these critical control periods that you can make use of. And I do believe that as sport horse breeders, you've got a hugely significant role to play in shaping the ability of the horse to cope with the demands of being involved in sport later. And there is new research that's being sort of done at the moment that is looking at selecting for particular traits. It's far more prevalent in farm animals than it is in horses. But, you know, obviously, as we start to understand a little bit more of the importance of priming for success or setting horses up for success, we'll start to understand a lot more about shaping those early experiences. It's important, I think, to consider breeding success in relation to breeding a very sustainable animal. It's interesting to me when you look at some of the research, for example, the one here that shows that when you study the DNA of a lot of thoroughbreds, for every 10% increase in DNA measured in breeding, there was a 48% decrease in the predicted odds of the horse making it to the track. So, you know, is that all health and conformation and so on, or is there something in here that's being passed on and intensified in terms of behavior as well as performance? Because some of these horses that don't make it to the track are not making it not just because of health reasons. We know that they're actually not fit for the job. They don't cope well with the job. Your own State of the Nation report in 2021 pointed out that, I mean, you may have improved this, but of the 80,000 sport horses that were foaled each year, the auction sales data accounts for just over 6,000 of them, which is less than 10% of production. So it'd be interesting to know, where are these other horses going? Do they all make it? And if they don't make it, you know, why are they not making it? Is it all because they're not high performance? Is it also because they may not necessarily be fit for the job that they're doing? And across many equestrian disciplines, the median competition career of a horse tends to be relatively short. And there is significant potential for the modification of the non-genetic component of this trait through manipulation of the early rearing environment and the management practices that we use. So we may need to consider, when breeding horses, that it's a little bit more than the pedigree and the performance and the points and so on, that there might be a whole range of other things that are used in other stud books for other species that might well be important in terms of looking at that sustainable sports horse. And I would suggest that things like behaviour and temperament might actually be important to start to think about how you include them. And there are other examples of big scale data projects. There's one called A Dog's Life in Edinburgh at the vet school that really is looking to collect as much data on Labradors, actually, collect as much data as they can and go beyond just the health data and the performance, and in their case it's health data, to start to include behavioural data as well. New research, excitingly, that has just been funded in Australia with Paul McGreevy and with Temple Grandin from the States, is looking at behaviour and temperament using genomic breeding tools to support improved performance and welfare outcomes through identifying the genes that make horses prone to behaving a certain way under specific conditions, so that they can establish a much more scientific foundation for breeding horses that are more reliably equipped with a temperament that suits the work that they do. And I think I'll stop there because I think that I've given you lots of random thinking and hopefully that will stimulate some conversation and some thinking yourselves as you move forward in developing your health and welfare strategy. And if you want to know more about the Equine Wellbeing, Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, we have a website, and there's a lot of free information on there around surveys and our own suggested strategy for setting horses up for a good life. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie. That was a really interesting and stimulating talk. I think I'm probably right in saying that this looks like we should have a few follow-on webinars focusing on some of the aspects you mentioned, because there seems to be really a lot for us to think about. And particularly, I think what's interesting is that we can kind of look at our role as breeders almost in two ways. One is that the breeding decisions we make obviously have a long-term effect on welfare in terms of breeding for the right genetic attributes. And I think we've talked a lot about breeding for soundness, you know, breeding horses that are capable of staying in the sport and staying healthy. But I think temperament there is a really interesting factor, and maybe something that we should learn more about, and particularly to learn that there can be a scientific approach to temperament, because it's all fair and good to say we need to focus on temperament, but it's not always so easy for us to really understand when we talk about good temperament in a horse. Is this something that we're based on our own intuition and feeling, or is this something that can be scientifically explored? And I think what we've learned tonight is that it can. So I think that would be a really interesting thing for us to look into further. And then the other side is that you highlighted that we can impact on the welfare of horses in our management. I think those are sort of two quite separate topics, obviously interrelated, but also really fascinating. And I'm really inspired by the fact that you said, you know, even if I have, for example, a foal who appears to be quite fearful at first, I can actually do things to positively impact on that horse's long-term approach to life. And I think that's really inspiring and really positive for all our breeders out there. Now, before I'm going to launch into the many questions that we're going to have from our breeders, can I remind everybody, please, not to use the Q&A anonymously, but with your names, because we would like to be able to, if necessary, follow on via email, because sometimes there's not enough time to go into enough depth in these webinars, and it would be nice to be able to do that. So please do use your name when you're using the Q&A. The other thing is, before I launch into all the questions, it would be really nice to know how many of our audience tonight are actually breeders and how many are just people interested in breeding. So I've done another poll again for everyone. If you could just quickly let us know. You should have a poll that just appeared on your screen, whether you're a breeder or just somebody interested in breeding. Of course, you're very welcome. We're always delighted when people join us who are just interested and want to learn more. But it looks like, looking at this, that we're being joined by a lot of breeders tonight, which I think is a great sign. It just shows how really relevant this topic is to breeders, especially now this time of year, I think, when we're starting, you know, to think ahead to the autumn. So thank you very much. Yes, it looks like 77% of our audience are in fact breeders. That's fantastic. So the questions that we had. So one question that I think has come up that is quite interesting is when you have a situation where there are behavioral problems between the mare and the foal. So here we have a case where the mare appears to be rejecting the foal or attacking the foal at 4 weeks old. So she's a maiden mare, so not an experienced mother. And the management of mare and foal is becoming quite difficult. So here I think we have a question of how do we weigh the two negatives, as it were, keeping the foal exposed in that relationship and exposed to potential attacks from that mare. On the other hand, the potential the impact on the foal of early weaning. What would be your thoughts on that, Natalie?
I'm sure that there's probably, of the 77% that were breeders here, they probably all have different ideas about this. I suppose I would just look at it from a welfare point of view. I think it's quite interesting that in turning the mare out, that she is better, in that she appears at least to not feel that she's, I'm assuming, confined and therefore having to guard her food. And being a maiden mare clearly has no understanding really of you know, what these foals get up to and the fact that they take liberties. But it's also of concern to me that she's still fence walking and unsettled. So I guess the first thing that, I mean, I don't know the circumstances, but the first thing I would ask really is, are there any other horses around? Because, you know, although we might think that it's great that she should be showing maternal behaviour and off she goes and she's got her foal with her, the reality for her is that she's probably feeling quite isolated. So if all the other horses are still in the stable and she's outside, then she will be unsettled. So the first thing I would try is putting another horse in another paddock next door so that at least she can settle, because she can see some, you know, what she considers to be a proper horse, not this annoying thing. But if the situation is such that the dam is attacking the foal, then you have to do the right thing for the foal, you know, and also that the mare will be highly stressed. You know, that's why she's attacking. If you can't deal with it within the circumstances that you've got, then you have to consider, well, if I have to do very early weaning, how do I reduce the impact that that's going to have on the foal? And from my point of view, one of the big things that we've just talked about, the abrupt weaning, particularly at very early stage, it does have an impact on the animal's gut because it's got to now fend for itself. And, you know, in some respects, you could, you know, bottle feed if you felt like or bucket feed if you can get them into bucket feeding on milk. You've got to be very careful that the foal then doesn't attach too much to the human. There's quite a lot of research that shows that that can lead to real problems with the human horse relationship later on, particularly with colts. They start to show sexual behavior towards the human if they become too bonded and there's no other horses that they you know, are obviously getting to know. So I think, you know, you just got to have to think through how you're going to do that if you're going to foal that animal early. But you know, at the end of the day, you've got to be pragmatic and safe about these things. And you've got to think about, you know, on balance, the welfare of both of those individuals.
That's great. Thank you very much. And really nice to think about, you know, which other factors could be stress factors, such as, you know, the lack of other mares around. Absolutely. Now, Anna has got a question. She wants to keep the colt that she has on the mare for quite long, and and the mare is not going back and forth, but I think she's a little nervous about at what point the colt would perhaps start to get interested in the mare in, you know, in ways that we want to avoid. So is it okay to leave them together until 9 to 10 months?
I think it just depends on how they're, you know, how they're faring, how they're getting on. I mean, if the mare is getting highly irritated by a young colt that's, you know, treating her like a play object and and testing his own kind of maleness, and she's not able to keep him away and have some privacy and space herself, then I think that it would be unfair to keep him there any longer, because he might be having a good time, but she clearly isn't. I mean, we know that foals can be weaned between 4 and 7 months. And I mean, if you can get to 7 months, well, from the research that you've seen, the foals, you know, if you handle the weaning process well, and, you know, the foal has maybe an older gelding that he can go out with, then, you know, the process would be fairly straightforward. I mean, at the end of the day, if we're going to have working horses, they get weaned. You know, our job is to try and make that weaning experience as positive as we can. Leave it as late as we can, depending on the foal's development. Some foals develop very early, some colts, and it becomes awful for the mares to have to, you know, constantly defend themselves. So I think, you know, it's nice to say there's a one answer, but there's no one fit. You know, it's all about the individuals that are involved, their relationship, where you live, the time of year, you know, how the grass is. I mean, you know, our grass starts to burn off. Well, normally in Hawke's Bay, we've had dreadful weather the last year, but, you know, we don't have any grass, so we're, you know, if you've got foals and mares here, you've got to really think about the nutrition of them both as well. So, you know, there's a whole range of factors that you would take into account alongside the behavior that those two individuals are showing to each other.
I mean, that's really interesting. Now, and one interesting question here was about the mare. So a lot of the studies seem to focus on the impact of the stress on the foals, but of course we know it's also stressful for the mares to, you know, to lose their foals. Are there any more studies on that subject, or are there any more planned on the subject?
There have been some studies that have been carried out on the mare, not so much. It does interest me actually, because I mean, I know the individual horse that you breed, that one horse may well be worth a lot of money, and hopefully is worth a lot of money and will go and have a great successful life. But your mare can have many foals, you know, and if you do it well and she has a good experience and she's, you know, obviously healthy and able to continue, she's worth more to you normally than those one-off prize horses. And therefore I think making sure that you are thinking about the stress you're putting her under, you know, and making sure that you're making the right decisions for her is really important. And so those questions that, you know, we've just talked about, you know, age of weaning and environment to wean into, and what do you do if, I think you've really got to think about the stress that those mares are under. On one hand, you know, when it goes well, it's a fantastic experience for them. But for young mares, maiden mares, we know that there's a whole bunch of learning, and there's a whole range of, there's a lot of preparation, especially if you're sort of small breeders, that you can put into your mares. So that they're set up for being able to deal with the interaction that they're going to have with, which is a very intense interaction with the foal for quite a long period of time, so that they are good, so that they're good models, you know, because you want your mares to model the right behaviors, just like we just showed with the fear study. You know, if you've got mares that are really frightened, and then you've got a foal that's born and the mare's frightened of everything, and you haven't put the work into the mare, well, then you're going to have no doubt about it, a very frightened foal. So, you know, I think you've got to think about what that mare brings to the equation, and it's significant.
I mean, that's really interesting. So it's almost a separate topic then on how we prepare and manage mares through pregnancies and motherhood, and what we can do there to improve the welfare of the mare. I mean, we all know one thing. We know this instinctively: happy mares make better foals. That just seems to be the case all the time. So we do know that it's worth, I think, as breeders to look after our mares' happiness. So I think, again, really positive what you're saying there about changes that we can make as breeders in behavioral management, but can have a positive impact on both foal and mare. So I find, well, we have a ridiculous number of questions still, golly. Shall we give this another 10 minutes? Is everybody happy with us, just to see that what we can get through? And if we don't manage to get to your question, please don't worry, because we can always get in touch with you afterwards, especially those of you who are asking the questions with your name. So one question that we have here is from a first-time breeder, Melissa, about if there are any studies about castrating in relation to weaning. So I guess, you know, in a colt's life, that is also quite a big event and potentially quite a stressful event. Often, of course, we like to castrate in the winter where we reduce the impact of flies.
I don't know whether there's a huge amount that's been done on the timing of castration in relation to weaning in horses. But I think the studies that I showed you about the priming that I talked about are probably quite relevant here, but it hasn't been done on horses. It's certainly a really interesting study. But the idea that, first of all, you wean, and if the horse is weaned and it goes well, from what we can see, there's a short-term acute stress, and then there's a catch-up, and everything, and the horse moves on. And then at some time later, you castrate them. And if the weaning process has gone well, and then they're castrated, then theoretically there should be no hangover from the weaning to the castration. But the idea of castrating at the same time as weaning, I'm not sure if this is the question. I don't know. I don't know whether I've got an answer to that. I would think particularly between 4 and 7 months of age, there might be a risk of being two major traumas all happening at the same time. I'm not even sure how practical it would be, bearing in mind that you're already dealing with an animal that's having an acute stress to do with its weaning. It's not feeding properly. It's not yet grown and got back on its feet after being weaned. And then, I think that you've got to really think about letting it develop a little bit before you then start to think about castrating it, because then it's going to be a much healthier individual. It'll cope better.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, that does seem to be a lot happening at the same time, doesn't it, if both are done together? Yeah, we've got a vote here from Elvira for leaving the foals in their original group and taking the mares out, that she finds in her breeding practice that has been quite a good way of doing it, and leaving them outside in the fields, I guess, where they're in their happy place. Also sort of, she felt was positive. I'm not sure that's really a question. I think that was just something that she wanted to share from her experience. Beth is asking for something quite interesting. She says, if there's the main practical takeaway for our breeders tonight for best practice in weaning, what would that be?
I think I'm going to go back to what the World Horse Welfare have called the 3 Fs, and that's fibre, freedom, and friends. And that's what horses, if you do, just to put it really simply, that's what horses seem to thrive on. Now, obviously, there's always the individual that doesn't like a friend and doesn't eat hay and whatever. But, generally speaking, if you can provide an environment for an animal post-weaning that enables it to have social contact with others, has the freedom to move around and play and do behaviours, and has a diet that has a lot of fibre in it. And that could be grass, or it depends on where you are in the world, it might be a fibre-based diet. Then at least you're setting that horse up for, being able to learn good social behaviour, be resilient, because it's able to actually, perform a lot of behaviours, because it's got that environment that allows it to be flexible, and allows it to adapt and have that kind of plasticity of behaviour, because it's in an enriched environment. And it's also got a healthy gut. It's a horse, it needs fibre. You're on mute again, Eva.
Oh God, sorry. I'm trying to spare you all the background noises at home. That's why. I have a really interesting question here from Celia Clark from the UK. She would like to know if there are any studies on how much the ranking of the mares in the herd, because we always know about alpha mares and lower and submissive mares, has on the effect that weaning has on the foals.
Yeah. So it's mare ranking is quite an interesting topic in itself, and a lot of people have written quite extensively on how you rank mares, because there's a whole range of different things that are deciders for, whether a mare is, we don't even use the word dominant and submissive anymore, that are high ranking and a low ranking. Because if you look at them from the point of view of aggression, which is the old-fashioned way of looking at ranking, if you like, those animals that were more aggressive showed more aggressive behaviour, and everybody moved away from them when they showed aggression, were seen to be the top-ranking mares. Whereas now what we talk about is mares that are socially higher in the hierarchy. And these mares often don't actually show very much aggressive behaviour at all. They don't need to. Everybody moves away. There's a kind of, a construct that's worked. And in some cases, what you see with ranking systems is that they are designed around food, for example. So you're always going to get some horses that food is just highly motivating and they will do anything to get to it. But that doesn't mean to say that they're going to be the ones that get first access to a mate or through a gate or whatever else, the other important things in life might be. So it is difficult, I think, first of all, I'm saying that's quite a long way around, but it's quite difficult to decide what is the high-ranking mare. However, if we're talking about social ranking in the way that I've just described, it is true that for the most part, those foals from the higher socially ranked mares do tend to be more likely to be socially higher in the ranking later in life. But I think my feeling about that is most of the work that's been done really shows that that's probably a learned response. It's one of those socially transmitted things, and it's quite important in herds. So most of this work's been done in free living herds, and if you look at those free living herds, you'll find that the mares there, because they're in a relatively stable situation, they know the social hierarchy, and the foals of those mares will be associated with those mares. And so the other mares and the other foals and so on will tend to treat them very much as if they're the same. In less stable groups, groups that haven't been together for many years, it might well be a little bit different.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. Another question about mares. Mares are really something that is really high on our priorities, I think, as breeders. We're always watching our mares and thinking about our mares. Is about bringing a mare back into work after she's had her foal, and the timing of that and the relationship to weaning of that. Is it an idea to bring the foal into the arena with the mare and start some work with the mare there, with the foal there, or is it better to leave that until and do an abrupt weaning and then start working the mare afterwards?
I think this really does depend on a number of different factors. First of all, the health of the foal, really, how healthy it is, how strong its bond is with its dam. You don't really want to impair its development, and you don't want to negatively affect its relationship with its mother. So I think those are key questions for me. I have done a bit of breeding, and my mare that was quite young actually when I bred from her the first time, she had a foal and she was back in work as soon as she was healthy enough, as soon as she was tight enough. She was back in work, I think, within about 3 or 4 weeks. Light work, the foal up foot, me sitting on her back in the arena, walking about, going for rides. She was very easy about it. Another mare I've had, I tried to do the same thing. It was a disaster. The mare was really worried about where her foal was all the time, wasn't able to focus on me, and the foal actually wasn't attached enough or was just more independent, and so the whole thing was very stressful for the mare and for me. So I think it's very dependent. I like it, and other people who are online may well comment. I liked it because I felt like it introduced the foal to the fact that horses get sat on, that mum doesn't always focus on you, she has to do other things. It also allowed me to teach the foal to stay in the box with another horse next door whilst the mare went to the arena, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It was a little bit like a progressive wean, but it was really done so that I could keep riding my horse. And in the end, I think we got to the point with that mare that we were able to go, I think it was a show ground that was around about, half an hour away, and we could go down, nip down, do a dressage test, come back, and she could feed her baby. And it's a very easy relationship, those two. But every relationship, as you know, is all different. So yeah,
I think that's a really, really good point to finish on. Thank you, because I think there is something in clearly not every mare is the same, not every foal is the same, and I think watch your mares and watch your foals, and treat them as individuals. I think is a really good starting point. We have run out of time for questions. I know there are quite a few more. A lot of them are quite specific about specific situations. So we will follow up with you all via email to continue the conversation. And I think this should really be a starting point for further webinars, because I think it's been really interesting, and I think we've touched on so many different topics. So I think it would be really fantastic to talk some more about some of those. So thank you so much for your time. It's been really fascinating, and I think it's been lovely to see the role that we can play in this bigger picture. And I think we're all very, very keen to play that role. And I think the high attendance and your participation in this webinar has shown that really, how much goodwill there is out there from us breeders to do the right thing and to do our bit to improve equine welfare for our horse-human relationship, for the sport, but really above all for our horses. So thank you so much to you, Natalie. Thank you to Nadine, who's done all the hard work setting this up and sending out invitations and reminders and managing everything. And a big, big thank you also to all of you who have attended tonight and who have participated with your questions. And hopefully we'll see you again very soon in this online forum. So it's good night from me, and good morning, I guess, to you, Natalie.
Yeah, it's a kia ora from me, and thank you very much indeed for staying on and listening and for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us, Natalie. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.